The Boston Strangler, the complete case explained. A Whispered Mysteries production. Welcome, listeners, to tonight's journey through one of America's most complex and haunting criminal mysteries. Find a comfortable position, allow your breathing to slow, and prepare to drift alongside me as we explore the complete story of the Boston Strangler. This is a case that challenged investigators, terrified a city, and continues to raise questions more than 6 decades after it began. Tonight, we will walk together through the streets of early 1960s Boston, a city caught between tradition and change, innocence and fear. We will meet the victims, honor their memories, and examine every thread of evidence that has emerged over more than half a century of investigation. Let your mind settle as we begin this careful, thorough exploration of a case that changed American criminal justice forever. Part 1. A City on the Edge of Change. To understand the Boston Strangler case, we must first understand Boston itself in the early 1960s. Picture a city of historic brick buildings and narrow streets, where church bells rang out over neighborhoods where families had lived for generations. The early years of the 1960s were a time of optimism in America, yet also of deep underlying tensions. Boston, in this era, was marked by systemic discrimination and collective affronts against black residents. Though before 1963, many believed there were good race relations in the city. The Combat Zone, Boston's adult entertainment district, was just beginning to form in the early 1960s. Created when city officials razed the West End and former red light district at Scollay Square to build the Government Center Urban Renewal Project, causing displaced residents to relocate to the lower Washington Street area. This was a city where most people still knew their neighbors, where women felt safe walking alone in the evening, where apartment doors were often left unlocked. Many buildings had no security systems beyond a simple lock, and the concept of living in fear of random violence was foreign to most residents. The Red Sox played at Fenway Park, where a box seat cost $3. Young families saved for modest homes in neighborhoods like Brighton, Dorchester, and Cambridge. Elderly women lived alone in small apartments, supported by Social Security checks and the occasional visit from grown children. The television was becoming a centerpiece of American life, and in June 1962, NBC was preparing to launch a new late-night program hosted by Johnny Carson. President John Kennedy, a native son of Massachusetts, occupied the White House. The Cold War cast its shadow, with Soviet missiles threatening Berlin and tensions rising near Cuba. Yet, for most Bostonians, these distant concerns seemed abstract compared to the rhythms of daily life, the changing seasons, the comfort of familiar routines. It was into this world of relative innocence and safety that terror would soon intrude. The murders that began in the summer of 1962 would shatter the sense of security that had defined urban life in Boston for generations. Women who had lived independently for years would suddenly find themselves afraid to sleep in their own beds. Neighbors would eye strangers with suspicion. Hardware stores would sell out of new locks and deadbolts. The Boston Strangler would transform not just the investigation of serial murder, but the very way Americans thought about safety in their own homes. Part 2. The First Victims and the Pattern Emerges. Uris found his mother's body on the kitchen floor, dressed in a housecoat that was ripped open, the cord knotted around her neck in a garish bow. Anna Slesers was sexually assaulted and strangled with the cord on her bathrobe, with the sash tied around her neck in a bow. The apartment showed signs of ransacking, though it was unclear whether theft had been a motive or merely a staging element. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Anna had opened her door to someone, perhaps believing them to be a service person or someone else she had reason to trust. The police who responded to the scene were troubled by certain aspects of the crime. The bow tied in the ligature around Anna's neck seemed almost theatrical, as if the killer wanted to leave a signature. The sexual nature of the assault combined with the violence of the murder painted a disturbing picture. Yet at this point, it was treated as an isolated incident, a single tragic murder in a city that, like all urban areas, occasionally experienced such crimes. 2 weeks would pass. On June 28, 1962, Mary Mullen, age 85, was found dead in her home. DeSalvo later said she died of a heart attack in his arms, which her death certificate confirmed. Though police initially investigated her death as potentially connected to the murder of Anna Slessers, the heart attack determination seemed to rule out foul play, and this case would not be officially included in the Strangler series by all investigators. Then came June 30th, 1962, a Saturday that would forever be remembered as a day of horror in the greater Boston area. On Saturday, June 30th, 1962, President Kennedy warned the Red World to keep hands off the Western Hemisphere. Brookline raised parking fines from $1 to $2, and at Hyannis Port, Gene Kennedy Smith arrived with 3 station wagons, a sedan, and a small minivan loaded with luggage, golf clubs, 3 dogs, hired help, and a birdcage. While people planned to attend bonfires and fireworks for the upcoming 4th of July holiday, 2 more women would lose their lives. Nina Nichols, 68, was sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings and found on June 30th, 1962. She lived in Brighton, in a tidy apartment where she had resided for years. Like Anna Slessers, Nina Nichols showed no signs of having struggled against a forced entry. The killer had gained access to her home through some means that did not alarm her or cause her to call for help. Helen Blake, 65, was sexually assaulted and strangled with her nylon stockings and found on June 30th, 1962, in her apartment at 73 Newhall Street in Lynn, Massachusetts. At the same time, a Lynn resident heard furniture being moved upstairs and assumed her neighbor, Helen Blake, was cleaning. 48 hours later, she would learn that the sounds were probably those of the Boston Strangler. Helen Blake was found face down on her bed, the bottom of her flannel pajamas on the floor, a stocking and a bra tied around her neck. The headlines the next day were explosive. 2 women slain the same day. The term silk stocking murder began appearing in newspapers. Police departments across the greater Boston area scrambled to understand what was happening. Were these murders connected? Was a single killer responsible? Or was Boston experiencing a cluster of unrelated crimes against elderly women? The pattern, however, was becoming impossible to ignore. All of the victims were women who lived alone. All were found in their own homes. All had been sexually assaulted. All had been strangled, often with their own clothing or household items. And in each case, the ligature had been tied in a distinctive bow, as if the killer were leaving a calling card, a signature that said, "I was here." The next victim would not be discovered for nearly 2 months, but when she was, the terror would deepen. Ida Irga, age 75, was discovered in her apartment on Grove Street in Boston. She had been sexually assaulted with a foreign object, and her body had been placed so it faced the door and would be the first thing the person entering would see. The deliberate positioning of the body suggested that the killer wanted to shock whoever discovered the victim, adding a psychological dimension to the physical violence. By late summer 1962, Boston was in a state of panic. 5 elderly women, all living alone, all murdered in remarkably similar fashion. A psychiatrist drawing a hypothetical sketch of the Strangler warned that he was physically small, a fact that nurtures a crippling inferiority complex, was a psychotic sex pervert suffering from a most malignant form of schizophrenia, and unless police got to him, he would kill again. Women across the city began changing their habits. Those who lived alone asked relatives to stay with them. New locks were installed on doors and windows. Gun shops reported increased sales. The Boston Police Department was overwhelmed with tips, leads, and reports of suspicious activity. Detectives worked around the clock, but the killer remained a phantom, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, no trail that investigators could follow. Then, after the murder of Jane Sullivan in August, The killings seemed to stop. September passed. October passed. November passed. Perhaps some hoped the strangler had died, been arrested for another crime, or moved away. Perhaps the nightmare was over. It was not. Part 3. A Terrifying Evolution. On December 5, 1962, Sophie Clark, aged 20 or 21, was murdered. She was found in her locked apartment at 515 Park Drive in the Back Bay area, the same area where the first victim and the most recent victim had both lived. Sophie Clark was young, a fact that sent shockwaves through the investigation and the public. Until now, all the confirmed victims had been elderly women. The assumption had been that the strangler targeted older women, perhaps because of some psychological fixation on mother figures, or because elderly women living alone were seen as easy targets. Sophie's murder shattered that theory. If the strangler was willing to kill young women as well as old, then virtually every woman in Boston was at risk. The profile that psychiatrists had been developing suddenly seemed incomplete. The investigation would have to reconsider everything it thought it knew about the killer's motives and methods. Patricia Bissett, age 23, was murdered on New Year's Eve in 1962. She was found in her apartment, another victim of the same brutal pattern: sexual assault, strangulation, the body arranged in a degrading position. The new year arrived with Boston in the grip of fear. The strangler had claimed 7 victims in 6 months. As winter gave way to spring, another name would be added to the grim list. Mary Brown, 69, was discovered on March 6, 1963. Mary Brown had been beaten to death in her apartment, and she had also been strangled and raped. The violence in this murder seemed even more intense than in previous cases, suggesting perhaps an escalation in the killer's rage or a loss of control. Beverly Sammons, age 26, was stabbed to death. Unlike most of the other victims, she was killed by multiple stab wounds rather than strangulation, though investigators found stockings and a scarf tied around her neck, suggesting the killer had attempted to maintain his signature even while using a different method. Some investigators questioned whether this murder was truly the work of the same person, or whether someone else might be imitating the strangler's methods. The public was terrified. The attacks continued despite extensive media publicity after the first few murders, and many residents purchased tear gas and new locks and deadbolts for their doors. Some women even moved out of the area in response to the killings. The Boston Police Department was under intense pressure from the public and the press. How could these murders continue for month after month without an arrest? Why couldn't the police protect the women of Boston? Evelyn Corbin, age 58, was found in her apartment on the first floor at 224 Lafayette in Salem. Joanne Graff, age 23, was found in her home at 54 Essex Street in Lawrence. The murders were now spreading beyond Boston proper to surrounding communities. Police jurisdictions complicated the investigation. Different cities had different detectives working different angles, and there was little coordination or information sharing between departments. At 44A Charles Street, 2 women arrived home from work at Filene's, saw their roommate Mary Sullivan in bed and decided to let her sleep. They prepared dinner, tried to rouse her, then discovered she was dead. Mary Sullivan was raped and strangled in her Boston apartment, with 3 ligatures wrapped around her neck and a broom handle lodged in her vagina. A card reading "Happy New Year" was left by the killer, leaning against her left foot. Mary Sullivan was 19 years old. When Sullivan graduated from Barnstable High School in 1962, classmates described her as happy-go-lucky. She had moved to Boston to start a new life, filled with hopes and dreams. Fate determined that she would be remembered as the 13th and final victim of the Boston Strangler. Part 4. The Strangler Bureau. By early January 1964, the pressure on law enforcement had reached a breaking point. 13 women were dead, and the Massachusetts Attorney General, Edward Brooke, had taken charge of the investigation personally. In 1964, in the face of mounting pressure, Massachusetts Attorney General Edward Brooke formed a Strangler task force to coordinate the investigation of these murders that had occurred in 5 separate cities and 3 counties. Edward Brooke was no ordinary law enforcement officer, nor was he an ordinary politician. He was a very handsome, intelligent, and polished professional, and he was also the only African-American attorney general in the country. Even more remarkable was the fact that he was a Republican in a solidly Democratic state. There were some real political risks to taking this on, particularly if the Strangler were never captured, but Brooke's plan made a great deal of practical sense. Massachusetts Attorney General Edward Brooke created a special task force to centralize the investigation, a unit known as the Strangler Bureau that was comprised of detectives from various departments. To head up this task force, formerly called the Special Division of Crime Research and Detection, he selected a close friend, Assistant Attorney General John S. Bottomley. Bottomley was a controversial choice because of his lack of experience in criminal law. However, as Bottomley's supporters pointed out, he was exceptionally honest and bubbled over with enthusiasm. Bottomley approached the case with fresh eyes and a determination to coordinate what had been a fragmented, chaotic investigation. The Strangler Bureau had several major pieces of business before it could hit the ground running. It had to collect, organize, and assimilate over 37,000 pages of material from the various police departments that had been involved in the case. Detectives pored over reports, witness statements, autopsy findings, and crime scene photographs. They began the painstaking work of looking for patterns, connections, anything that might point toward the identity of the killer. For the medical committee, they had the task of developing a profile of the kind of person who would commit the murders. The forensic medical experts saw important differences between the murders of the older women and the younger women, and for that reason, they thought it was unlikely that one person was responsible for all of the killings. This would become a crucial point of debate, one that continues to this day. Was there one Boston Strangler, or were there several killers whose crimes became conflated in the public mind? In what would become one of the more controversial decisions of the investigation, at Bottomley's suggestion, Brooke finally consented to a risky move: the involvement of Peter Hurkos, the well-known Dutch psychic. 2 private groups paid for Hurkos' services and expenses. Hurkos was a difficult person to work with and ultimately got into difficulty for allegedly impersonating an FBI agent. The psychic gave a description of the killer, allegedly based on the auras given off by items associated with the murders, but again, the killer described by the psychic did not match DeSalvo's characteristics. 2 months later, Governor Peabody offered a $10,000 reward to any person furnishing information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person who had committed the murders of the 11 official victims of the Strangler. This reward would become important later as one possible motive for a false confession. The investigation continued through 1964, with thousands of tips flooding in but no clear breakthrough. Detectives interviewed hundreds of suspects. They staked out apartments. They worked with psychiatrists to develop psychological profiles. Yet the killer remained elusive, a ghost who struck without warning and vanished without trace. Then, in October 1964, an entirely different case would lead police to a man who would change the course of the investigation forever. His name was Albert DeSalvo. Part 5: The Green Man and the Measuring Man. To understand Albert DeSalvo, we must begin with his origins. Albert DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, as the third of 6 children to Charlotte Roberts and Frank DeSalvo. His childhood was marked by extreme violence and dysfunction. DeSalvo's father was a violent alcoholic who abused his wife and children. In one of the many times he attacked his wife in front of the children, he knocked out all her teeth and bent her fingers back until they broke. DeSalvo's father would also bring home prostitutes and engage in sexual acts with them in front of family members, including the children. DeSalvo himself was sold by his father to work as a farm laborer, along with 2 of his sisters. The young DeSalvo began torturing animals as a child. In early adolescence, he engaged in acts of petty theft and shoplifting. frequently crossing paths with the law. In 1943, DeSalvo, then aged 12, was arrested for battery and robbery and was subsequently sent to the Lyman School for Boys. In October 1944, DeSalvo was paroled and started working as a delivery boy. DeSalvo served in the U.S. Army, where he met and married a German woman named Irmgard Beck. They had 2 children together. By all outward appearances, DeSalvo seemed to be trying to build a normal life. He worked as a handyman and maintenance worker, taking on odd jobs around the greater Boston area. But beneath this facade of normalcy, darker impulses were at work. In March of 1960, police caught a man breaking into a house and he confessed to the burglary. Without any prompting, he also confessed to being the measuring man. This was Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo gained entrance to homes by pretending to be from a modeling agency and used this ruse to try to fondle the women. Police knew DeSalvo as the measuring man because he pretended to take the measurements of the women he was molesting. The judge sentenced DeSalvo to 18 months in jail, but he was released after 11 months for good behavior. Following his release, he began a new crime spree throughout Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. During this spree, DeSalvo, while dressed in green, broke into over 400 homes and sexually assaulted over 300 women. While police throughout New England were in search of the Green Man, Boston homicide detectives continued their search for the Boston Strangler. On October 27, 1964, a stranger entered a young woman's home in East Cambridge posing as a detective. He tied his victim to her bed, sexually assaulted her, and left after undoing her restraints, apologizing as he departed. The woman's description led police to identify the assailant as DeSalvo. When his photo was published, many women identified DeSalvo as the man who had assaulted them in the Green Man attacks. It was at Bridgewater that the story would take its most dramatic turn, when a convicted murderer named George Nassar would hear words that would forever link DeSalvo's name to the Boston Strangler. Part 6. The Confession. George Henry Nassar was born on June 7, 1932, in Providence, Rhode Island, the oldest of 2 children of Helen George and Henry Nassar, both of Assyrian descent. Nassar was subsequently arrested and sent to Bridgewater to await his trial. Psychological examiners assessed him as above-average intelligence and diagnosed him as paranoid schizophrenic with an extremely severe sociopathic personality disorder. DeSalvo started sharing details that seemingly only the Boston Strangler himself would know with fellow inmate George Nassar. In 1995, Nassar recalled in an interview with the Boston Globe that DeSalvo had described the killings 30 years earlier as they walked along a concrete hallway at Bridgewater State Hospital. Nassar said DeSalvo began describing a crime and watching his reaction to see if it was too abhorrent to listen to. Some of it was horrible, particularly the crimes of stabbing a woman under her breasts in Cambridge. Nassar is serving a life sentence for unrelated murder. In a rare television interview in 2018, Nassar told the I-Team he met DeSalvo at Bridgewater State Hospital in 1965. Nassar, who at the time was represented by F. Lee Bailey, got the famed defense attorney to take DeSalvo's case, according to Nassar. Nassar described setting it all up. "We were setting it all up, saying, Al, you're going to confess, you're going to trial, you're going to do your book, we're going to take care of your family," and he was saying, okay. This statement would later fuel speculation that the confession was manufactured, that DeSalvo and Nassar had conspired to claim the Strangler murders for financial gain. Nassar called his lawyer F. Lee Bailey. F. Lee Bailey, who had already distinguished himself in the Dr. Sam Shepard case, was George Nassar's lawyer. Bailey heard about DeSalvo from Nassar and went to visit Albert with a dictaphone on March 6, 1965. What Bailey heard during those interviews would make headlines around the world. DeSalvo provided hours of detailed, tape-recorded confessions to Bailey and investigators. DeSalvo's confessions were specific. He recounted details about the crime scenes that had not been released to the public, which gave his claims a strong sense of credibility at the time. DeSalvo told Bailey on tape that he had killed all 11 of the aforementioned women, as well as 69-year-old Mary Brown in Lawrence on March 9, 1963. He was going to kill another woman in 1962, he said, but she died from a heart attack before he could strangle her. This was 85-year-old Mary Mullen, whose death had been initially ruled natural causes. DeSalvo's confessions were extensive and detailed. He described the layouts of the apartments, the clothing the victims wore, the positions of furniture, personal items in the homes. He spoke of his methods, how he gained entry to the apartments by posing as a maintenance worker or handyman. He described his compulsions, the irresistible urges that drove him to enter these women's homes. He spoke of the murders with a clinical detachment that chilled those who heard the tapes. John Bottomley conducted his own extensive interviews with DeSalvo, sessions that lasted for hours. Bottomley was impressed by the level of detail DeSalvo provided. Some of the information DeSalvo shared had never been made public and could only have been known by the killer or by someone who had access to confidential police files. DeSalvo also confessed to hundreds of break-ins and assaults as the Green Man and the Measuring Man. The sheer volume of crimes he claimed to have committed was staggering. Some investigators wondered whether DeSalvo was a serial confessor, someone with a psychological need to claim responsibility for notorious crimes. The confession created a dilemma for law enforcement and prosecutors. On one hand, they had a suspect who knew details about the murders that seemed to confirm his guilt. On the other hand, they had no physical evidence linking DeSalvo to any of the Strangler crime scenes. No fingerprints, no DNA, though DNA testing did not exist in 1965. No witnesses who could place him at any of the murder scenes. No murder weapon, though in these cases the ligatures were items found in the victims' homes. F. Lee Bailey faced his own ethical considerations. His client was confessing to being one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Yet Bailey could not use this information to help Nassar's case without violating attorney-client privilege. Eventually, Bailey took on DeSalvo as a separate client, allowing him to share DeSalvo's confession with authorities. The media frenzy was immediate and intense. Headlines screamed that the Boston Strangler had been caught. The public felt relief that the killer who had terrorized the city for 18 months was finally behind bars. But some investigators remained skeptical. The medical committee that had been assembled by the Strangler Bureau continued to maintain that the murders showed signs of multiple perpetrators, not a single killer. The confession raised as many questions as it answered. How had DeSalvo obtained such detailed information about the crimes? If he was the killer, why had he left no physical evidence? If he was not the killer, who was feeding him information and why? These questions would haunt the case for the next half-century. Part 7. The Trial That Never Was. Albert DeSalvo was never tried for any of the Boston Strangler murders. This fact surprises many people who learn about the case. Despite his detailed confessions, prosecutors did not believe they had sufficient evidence to secure a conviction in any of the strangulation cases. There were several reasons for this prosecutorial caution. First, DeSalvo's confession had been given to his attorney, not directly to police, which raised questions about its admissibility in court. Second, the confession contained inconsistencies and errors that a defense attorney could exploit. Third, and most importantly, there was no physical evidence linking DeSalvo to the murder scenes. Under Massachusetts law at the time, a confession alone was not sufficient for a conviction. Prosecutors needed corroborating evidence, something that independently verified the confession. Without physical evidence or eyewitness testimony, securing a conviction would be extremely difficult, perhaps impossible. Instead, DeSalvo was tried for the Green Man crimes, the series of sexual assaults and burglaries he had committed across New England. In these cases, there were victims who could identify him, physical evidence that placed him at crime scenes, and a clear pattern of behavior. The trial began in January 1967 in Middlesex County Superior Court in Cambridge. F. Lee Bailey mounted an unusual defense. Rather than denying that DeSalvo had committed the Green Man assaults, Bailey argued that DeSalvo was legally insane and therefore not responsible for his actions. Bailey presented psychiatric testimony about DeSalvo's troubled childhood, his inability to control his compulsions, his diagnosis as a sociopath with schizoid features. The prosecution countered with its own psychiatric experts who testified that while DeSalvo was certainly disturbed, he understood the difference between right and wrong and was capable of controlling his behavior. The jury deliberated and found DeSalvo guilty on multiple counts of assault, burglary, and other charges related to the Green Man crimes. The Boston Strangler murders remained officially unsolved. DeSalvo was widely believed to be the killer, based on his confessions and the publicity surrounding the case. But legally, he had never been charged, never been tried, and never been convicted of being the Boston Strangler. This legal limbo would have significant consequences. Victims' families were denied the closure of a trial. The public never got to see the evidence laid out in court. Questions about DeSalvo's guilt or innocence would continue to swirl for decades. And DeSalvo himself would spend the rest of his life in prison, not for the murders that made him infamous, but for the assaults and burglaries that preceded them. Bailey later expressed frustration with the outcome. He believed that a trial for the Strangler murders, even if it resulted in a not guilty verdict by reason of insanity, would have provided clarity and closure. Instead, the case remained murky, unsatisfying, a mystery with an answer that many people doubted. DeSalvo, for his part, seemed to vacillate on his guilt. At times, he stood by his confession, insisting that he was indeed the Boston Strangler. At other times, he hinted that he might have been lying, that he had confessed for other reasons. This ambiguity only deepened the uncertainty surrounding the case. Part 8. Life Behind Bars and Questions Unanswered. DeSalvo's years in prison were marked by continued controversy and questions about his role in the Strangler murders. He became something of a celebrity inmate, with his name forever linked to one of America's most notorious crime sprees. Yet, as the years passed, doubts about his confession grew stronger. In prison, DeSalvo gave interviews to reporters and authors. He spoke to psychiatrists and researchers studying serial killers. His accounts of the murders remained detailed, but inconsistencies continued to emerge. Some details changed from one telling to the next. Other details that should have been seared into his memory seemed fuzzy or confused. Author Gerald Frank published The Boston Strangler in 1966, a book that presented DeSalvo as definitively guilty of all the murders. The book became a bestseller and was adapted into a 1968 film starring Tony Curtis as DeSalvo and Henry Fonda as John Bottomley. The movie further cemented in the public mind the image of DeSalvo as the lone Boston Strangler. However, investigators who worked the original cases were not all convinced. Some detectives believed that DeSalvo might have been responsible for some of the murders, but not all of them. The murders of the elderly women and the murders of the younger women showed different patterns, different levels of violence, different methods. Could one man really be responsible for such varied killings? There was also the question of motive. Why would DeSalvo confess to murders he did not commit? Several theories emerged. One was the reward money that Governor Peabody had offered. DeSalvo's family was struggling financially, and there was speculation that he hoped to earn the reward money through a book or movie deal based on his confession. He could not collect the reward himself since he was the perpetrator, but perhaps he believed his family could benefit. Another theory involved George Nassar. Some investigators suspected that Nassar, who was highly intelligent and manipulative, had fed DeSalvo information about the murders and coached him on what to say. Nassar had been evaluated as having above-average intelligence and had access to newspapers and crime reports while at Bridgewater. Could he have orchestrated the confession as part of some elaborate scheme? A third possibility was that DeSalvo was a serial confessor, someone with a psychological need to claim responsibility for infamous crimes. Some criminals confess to crimes they did not commit because it gives them a sense of importance, notoriety, or power. DeSalvo's troubled childhood and need for attention might have driven him to falsely confess. The debate continued through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. DeSalvo remained in Walpole State Prison, maintaining his claim to be the Boston Strangler, while simultaneously hinting that there was more to the story than anyone knew. On February 24, 1967, DeSalvo escaped from Bridgewater State Hospital during a sick call. In a move that baffled authorities, he traveled to meet with his lawyer, F. Lee Bailey, before turning himself in. DeSalvo claimed he escaped to draw attention to the poor conditions at Bridgewater and to protest his confinement. The escape lasted less than a day, but it demonstrated DeSalvo's ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. Then, in the early morning hours of November 25, 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison. He was 42 years old. The murder occurred during a period of significant unrest and violence at the prison. DeSalvo had been stabbed multiple times in the heart. His killer or killers were never officially identified, though there were rumors and speculation about who might have been responsible. Some believed DeSalvo was killed by other inmates who viewed him as a child killer and sexual predator, crimes that are particularly despised in prison culture. Others speculated that he was killed to silence him, perhaps because he was preparing to recant his confession or reveal information about the true Boston Strangler. DeSalvo's murder added another layer of mystery to an already complex case. Whatever secrets he held about the Boston Strangler murders died with him that November night. The case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved, a historical mystery that would tantalize and frustrate investigators for generations. Part 9. The Victims Remembered. Before we continue further into the investigation and its aftermath, we must pause to honor and remember the women whose lives were taken. The Boston Strangler case is often told as a story about the investigation, the manhunt, the controversial confession. But at its heart, this is a story about 13 women who had their lives violently stolen from them. Anna Sleesers, the first victim, was 55 years old when she died. She had survived the Russian invasion of Latvia, had emigrated to America seeking safety and opportunity, had built a life for herself as a seamstress. She was a mother who was supposed to attend a memorial service with her son on the night she died. Instead, her son found her body and his life was forever changed. Nina Nichols was 68, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression, who had seen America change and grow. She lived independently in Brighton, managing her own household, maintaining her dignity and autonomy in her later years. Helen Blake, also 65, lived in Lynn. These elderly women had earned their peace and security through decades of hard work and perseverance. Ida Irga was 75, a member of what has been called the Greatest Generation, people who had endured economic collapse and World War. Jane Sullivan was 67, a night nurse who had dedicated her career to caring for others. She worked at Longwood Hospital providing comfort and medical care to patients during their darkest hours. She deserved to come home to safety and rest after her shifts. Then came the younger victims, women just beginning their adult lives. Sophie Clark was 20 or 21, studying at the Carnegie Institute of Medical Technology. She had dreams of a career in healthcare, of making a difference in the world. Her murder shattered the assumption that the Strangler only targeted elderly women and sent waves of fear through Boston's younger population. Patricia Bissett was 23, killed on New Year's Eve, a night that should have been filled with celebration and hope for the year ahead. Instead, she became another name on the list of victims, another life cut short by senseless violence. Joanne Graff was 23, living in Lawrence. Evelyn Corbin was 58, living in Salem. Each had her own story, her own family, her own hopes and dreams. Mary Brown, at 69, had lived through more than 2/3 of a century, accumulating a lifetime of memories and relationships. And finally, Mary Sullivan, just 19 years old. She had graduated from Barnstable High School in 1962, described by her classmates as happy-go-lucky. She had recently moved to Boston to start her life as an independent adult, excited about the possibilities ahead of her. Her murder, the final one in the series, was particularly brutal and seemed designed to shock and horrify whoever discovered her body. These women were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, neighbors. They were nurses and students and workers. They were individuals with personalities and quirks, with favorite songs and foods, with inside jokes and cherished memories. The Boston Strangler case reduced them to victims, to crime scene photographs, to evidence in an investigation. But they were so much more than that. Their families suffered immeasurable grief. Parents outlived their children. Children lost their mothers. Siblings lost sisters. Friends lost companions. The ripples of trauma spread outward from each murder, touching countless lives. Some family members would spend decades seeking answers, fighting for justice, demanding that investigators not forget these women. The terror that gripped Boston during those 18 months also scarred the city's collective psyche. Women who lived through that era remembered the fear, the precautions, the constant awareness of danger. They remembered the warnings not to open doors to strangers, the advice to have neighbors check on them, the recommendations to live with roommates rather than alone. The Boston Strangler murders changed how Americans thought about urban safety. Before these killings, many people believed that violence was something that happened on the streets, in dark alleys, in dangerous neighborhoods. The Strangler showed that violence could invade the home, the one place where people should feel completely safe. This realization had profound effects on American culture, contributing to increased security measures, changes in apartment design, and a general loss of innocence about urban living. Each victim left behind a void that could never be filled. Anna Sleezers left behind a son who would carry the trauma of discovering his mother's body for the rest of his life. Mary Sullivan left behind parents who would fight for decades to prove that DeSalvo had not killed their daughter. The other victims left behind similar legacies of grief, unanswered questions, and unhealed wounds. In remembering these women, we must resist the temptation to focus solely on how they died and instead honor how they lived. They were not simply victims of a notorious serial killer. They were human beings who laughed and cried, who worked and loved, who contributed to their communities and touched the lives of those around them. Their deaths were tragic, but their lives had meaning and value that extended far beyond the violent acts that ended them. Part 10. Alternative Theories and Lingering Doubts. As the years passed after DeSalvo's death, questions about his guilt intensified rather than faded. Investigators, journalists, and researchers began taking a closer look at the evidence, or lack thereof, connecting DeSalvo to the murders. What they found raised serious doubts about whether DeSalvo had been the Boston Strangler at all. One of the most persistent critics of the DeSalvo confession was Susan Kelly, who wrote The Boston Stranglers, the public conviction of Albert DeSalvo, and the true story of 11 shocking murders in 1995. Kelly's research revealed significant problems with DeSalvo's confession. She documented numerous factual errors in his accounts, details that contradicted the physical evidence or witness statements. Kelly and other researchers suggested that DeSalvo might have obtained his information from various sources. Crime scene photographs had been shown to numerous suspects during the investigation. Details about the murders had been published in newspapers. DeSalvo had been at Bridgewater State Hospital with George Nassar, who had access to information about the crimes. It was possible that DeSalvo had pieced together his confession from second-hand knowledge rather than first-hand experience. The forensic psychiatrists who had examined the cases for the Strangler Bureau continued to maintain that the murders showed signs of multiple perpetrators. The early victims, mostly elderly women, were killed in a relatively controlled manner. The killer seemed methodical, careful, organized. The later victims, particularly the younger women, were killed with increasing violence and apparent rage. The murder of Beverly Salmons, with its multiple stab wounds, seemed completely different in character from the strangulation deaths. Some investigators theorize that there might have been 2 or even 3 different killers whose crimes became conflated into a single Boston Strangler narrative. The media coverage and public panic had created pressure to find a single explanation, a lone monster responsible for all the terror. But the evidence, viewed objectively, suggested a more complex picture. Another line of inquiry focused on alternative suspects. Over the years, various individuals were identified as possible perpetrators of some or all of the murders. These suspects included men who had been interviewed during the original investigation but never charged, individuals who had died before DeSalvo's confession, and others who came to light in subsequent decades. One alternative suspect was a man who had been questioned extensively by police in the early 1960s. He had a history of violence against women, had been in the vicinity of several murders, and matched some witness descriptions. However, police had never been able to develop sufficient evidence to charge him, and he eventually moved out of the area. Another potential suspect was identified by researcher and author Casey Sherman, who was Mary Sullivan's nephew. Sherman became convinced that DeSalvo had not killed his aunt and dedicated himself to uncovering the truth. His investigation led him to examine other suspects, including men who had been overlooked or dismissed during the original investigation. The possibility of multiple killers was supported by the geographic distribution of the murders. While most occurred in Boston proper, others happened in surrounding communities like Lynn, Lawrence, and Salem. The timing of the murders also varied, with clusters of killings followed by quiet periods. This pattern could suggest different perpetrators operating independently, rather than a single killer. There was also the question of motive. Serial killers typically have recognizable patterns in their victim selection and methods. The Boston Strangler murders showed significant variation in both. The ages of victims ranged from 19 to 85. The methods, while generally involving strangulation, varied in details. Some victims were sexually assaulted before death, others after. Some crime scenes showed signs of ransacking, others did not. Criminal profilers who later examined the case noted these inconsistencies. Modern understanding of serial killers suggests that they typically have a specific victim type and a relatively consistent method of killing. While killers do sometimes evolve or escalate, the degree of variation in the Boston Strangler cases was unusual. Yet another complicating factor was the police investigation itself. In the early 1960s, forensic science was far less advanced than it is today. Crime scenes were not always processed with the same rigor that modern investigators would employ. Evidence was sometimes mishandled or lost. Different police departments investigating different murders did not always share information effectively. Some critics suggested that once DeSalvo confessed, investigators stopped looking for alternative explanations. Evidence that contradicted his confession was downplayed or ignored. Leads pointing to other suspects were not pursued. The desire for closure, both for the public and for the exhausted investigators, overrode the need for absolute certainty. The families of victims had mixed reactions to DeSalvo's confession. Some believed it and felt relief that the killer had been identified. Others, particularly the family of Mary Sullivan, never accepted that DeSalvo was responsible. Mary's nephew Casey Sherman would become one of the most vocal advocates for continued investigation, arguing that the real killer or killers had never been brought to justice. Sherman's research uncovered numerous problems with the official narrative. He found witnesses who had been ignored, evidence that had been mishandled, and alternative suspects who had not been adequately investigated. His book, A Rose for Mary, presented a compelling case that DeSalvo had not killed his aunt and raised broader questions about the entire investigation. Another researcher, Elaine Sharp, who served as an attorney for the DeSalvo family, also raised questions about Albert's guilt. She pointed to the lack of physical evidence, the inconsistencies in his confession, and the financial motives that might have driven a false confession. Sharp argued that DeSalvo had been scapegoated, that investigators had been too eager to accept his confession because it allowed them to close the case. The alternative theories ranged from the plausible to the speculative. Some suggested that the Green Man crimes and the Strangler murders were committed by different people, and that DeSalvo had only confessed to the latter to gain notoriety. Others proposed that DeSalvo had been an accomplice to the real killer, participating in some murders, but not all. Still others maintained that DeSalvo was entirely innocent and that the true Boston Strangler had never been caught. What all these theories had in common was a recognition that the official narrative, which presented DeSalvo as the sole perpetrator of all 13 murders, was problematic. The evidence supporting this narrative was circumstantial at best. The confession, while detailed, was unreliable, and the failure to prosecute DeSalvo for any of the Strangler murders suggested that even prosecutors at the time had doubts about securing a conviction. Part 11. The dawn of DNA testing. For decades after DeSalvo's death, the Boston Strangler case remained a historical mystery, debated by true crime enthusiasts and researchers but seemingly beyond the reach of definitive resolution. Then, in the 1990s and 2000s, advances in DNA technology offered new hope for solving cold cases. DNA analysis had been used in criminal investigations since the mid-1980s, but the technology continued to improve dramatically. By the early 2000s, forensic scientists could extract and analyze DNA from increasingly small and degraded samples. Evidence that had been collected in the 1960s and stored for decades could potentially yield genetic profiles that would identify perpetrators with near certainty. The family of Mary Sullivan, led by Casey Sherman, began pushing for DNA testing of evidence from her murder. They wanted definitive proof of whether Albert DeSalvo had killed Mary, or whether, as they believed, someone else was responsible. The family's efforts were complicated by legal and bureaucratic obstacles. Evidence from the 1960s had been stored haphazardly. Some items had been lost or destroyed. Others were in poor condition after decades of storage. In 2000, DNA testing was conducted on evidence from the Mary Sullivan murder scene. The results were startling. The DNA profile obtained from semen samples did not match Albert DeSalvo. This finding seemed to confirm what the Sullivan family had long believed, that DeSalvo had not killed Mary. The controversy intensified. If DeSalvo had not killed Mary Sullivan, had he killed any of the other victims? Or had he falsely confessed to all of the murders? The DNA results reopened questions that many had considered settled. In 2013, another breakthrough occurred. Investigators announced that they had obtained DNA evidence linking Albert DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan. This evidence came from a new round of testing using more advanced techniques. The key development was obtaining a DNA sample from DeSalvo himself, which required exhuming his body from its burial site. On July 11, 2013, DeSalvo's body was exhumed from Puritan Lawn Cemetery in Peabody, Massachusetts. The exhumation was conducted under court order, with careful attention to legal procedures and chain of custody. DNA samples were collected from DeSalvo's remains and sent to forensic laboratories for analysis. The testing took several months. Forensic scientists worked to develop a complete DNA profile from DeSalvo's remains, which were nearly 40 years old. They then compared this profile to DNA evidence that had been preserved from the Mary Sullivan crime scene, specifically DNA found on a blanket and on Mary's body. The results were announced in a press conference that drew national media attention. According to investigators, the DNA from DeSalvo's body matched DNA from the Mary Sullivan crime scene with extremely high certainty. The statistical probability of the match being coincidental was calculated as approximately 1 in 220 billion. This announcement seemed to finally answer the question of DeSalvo's guilt, at least in the case of Mary Sullivan. Law enforcement officials declared that they were now convinced DeSalvo had killed Mary, and, by extension, was likely responsible for the other Boston Strangler murders as well. However, even this seemingly definitive evidence did not end the controversy. Critics pointed out that the DNA testing only linked DeSalvo to one murder, Mary Sullivan's. It did not prove he had killed any of the other victims. Given the questions about whether all the murders were committed by the same person, solving one case did not necessarily solve all of them. There were also questions about the DNA evidence itself. Some forensic experts noted that DNA could have been transferred to the crime scene through secondary contact rather than the perpetrator being present. While this was considered unlikely given the nature and location of the DNA evidence, it could not be completely ruled out. Casey Sherman, despite the DNA results, continued to raise questions. He noted discrepancies between DeSalvo's confession and the physical evidence in his aunt's murder. He pointed to timeline issues and factual errors in DeSalvo's account. While the DNA evidence indicated DeSalvo had been in contact with Mary Sullivan, Sherman argued it did not definitively prove that DeSalvo had murdered her. The 2013 DNA results did convince many skeptics, however. Investigators who had worked the original case felt vindicated. The public, which had been told for nearly 50 years that DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, saw the DNA evidence as confirmation of that narrative. Media coverage generally presented the results as definitive proof of DeSalvo's guilt. Yet, the limitations of the DNA evidence remained. Only one of the 13 murders had been solved through genetic analysis. Evidence from the other crime scenes had either been lost, destroyed, or was too degraded for testing. Without DNA evidence from the other murders, questions about whether DeSalvo had killed all the victims, some of them, or only Mary Sullivan would continue. The DNA findings also raised new questions. If DeSalvo had killed Mary Sullivan, why had his confession contained so many inaccuracies about her murder? Had he actually committed the crime but misremembered details years later? Or had he committed the murder but embellished his confession with false information for reasons that remain unclear? Part 12. Modern Forensic Review and Investigative Lessons. The Boston Strangler case has become a touchstone for discussions about forensic science, investigative procedures, and the evolution of criminal justice. Modern law enforcement and forensic experts have studied the case extensively, examining what went right, what went wrong, and what lessons can be learned. One of the most significant issues was the lack of coordination between different police departments. In the early 1960s, the murders occurred in multiple jurisdictions: Boston, Lynn, Lawrence, Salem, and other communities. Each police department initially investigated its own cases independently. Information was not shared systematically. Investigators did not realize the full scope of the serial murders until several had already occurred. The formation of the Strangler Bureau was an attempt to address this fragmentation, but it came relatively late in the series of murders. Modern law enforcement has learned from this failure. Today, protocols exist for multi-jurisdictional task forces. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, maintains a database of violent crimes that allows investigators across the country to identify patterns and connections. Regional fusion centers facilitate information sharing between agencies. The Boston Strangler case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the 1960s. Crime scene processing was rudimentary by modern standards. Fingerprint analysis was the primary forensic tool, and even that was not always applied rigorously. Trace evidence, blood spatter analysis, and other techniques that are routine today were either unknown or not widely used. The absence of DNA technology in the 1960s meant that biological evidence, while collected, could not be analyzed in ways that would definitively identify perpetrators. Semen samples, hair samples, and other biological materials were preserved but could only be analyzed using blood typing, which provided limited information. The development of DNA profiling in the 1980s and its continuous refinement since then has revolutionized criminal investigation. But cases like the Boston Strangler occurred just before this revolution began. The case also raised important questions about the reliability of confessions. DeSalvo's confession was detailed and compelling, yet it contained errors and inconsistencies. Modern understanding of false confessions has grown significantly since the 1960s. Researchers have identified numerous factors that can lead innocent people to confess to crimes they did not commit. Psychological pressure, desire for attention or notoriety, mental illness, promises of leniency, and coercion by investigators. While there is no evidence that DeSalvo was coerced into confessing, the other factors may have been at play. His troubled psychological state, his need for attention, the financial incentives of a book deal, and the influence of George Nassar and F. Lee Bailey all may have contributed to a confession that was partly or wholly false. Modern interrogation protocols emphasize recording all interviews, using non-coercive techniques, and seeking corroboration of confessions through independent evidence. The fact that DeSalvo was never tried for the Strangler murders reflects prosecutors' recognition, even in the 1960s, that confession alone was insufficient for conviction without corroborating evidence. The media coverage of the Boston Strangler case also set patterns that continue today. The intense publicity, the sensational headlines, the public panic all influenced how the case was investigated and perceived. Investigators faced enormous pressure to solve the murders quickly. This pressure may have led to premature acceptance of DeSalvo's confession and insufficient scrutiny of alternative theories. The case also had lasting impacts on public attitudes toward safety and security. The Boston Strangler murders are often cited as a watershed moment when Americans began to view their homes as potentially vulnerable spaces. The installation of chain locks, peepholes, and security systems became more common. Women living alone took increased precautions. The general sense of urban safety eroded. From a criminological perspective, the Boston Strangler case contributed to the development of serial killer profiling. The psychiatric consultants who worked with the Strangler Bureau were among the early practitioners of what would later become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. While their profile of the Strangler was not entirely accurate, the attempt to understand the psychology of serial killers through behavioral analysis was pioneering. Modern profilers studying the case note the challenges posed by the apparent variation in victim selection and methods. Serial killers are typically understood to have patterns, signatures, and preferred victim types. The Boston Strangler murders, if committed by a single person, showed unusual flexibility and adaptation. This has led some experts to conclude that multiple killers were likely responsible, while others argue that some serial killers are more variable than traditional profiles would suggest. The legal handling of the case also provides lessons. The decision not to try DeSalvo for the Strangler murders, despite his confession, was based on the lack of corroborating evidence. This caution, while frustrating to many, protected the integrity of the legal system. A trial without solid evidence might have resulted in an acquittal, which would have precluded future prosecution even if new evidence emerged. However, the failure to hold a trial also meant that the evidence was never subjected to the adversarial process that is designed to test its reliability. Defense attorneys never had the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, challenge the confession's credibility, or present alternative theories. The public never got to see the full case laid out transparently. This lack of a trial left many questions unanswered and contributed to decades of doubt and controversy. The preservation of evidence from the Boston Strangler cases proved crucial decades later when DNA technology became available. This underscores the importance of properly collecting, documenting, and storing physical evidence even when its immediate utility is not apparent. Many cold cases have been solved years or decades later because investigators in earlier eras had the foresight to preserve biological evidence. The Boston Strangler investigation also demonstrates the value of persistence. Family members like Casey Sherman refused to accept the official narrative and continued pushing for answers decades after the murders. Their advocacy led to the DNA testing that finally provided some measure of closure, even if it did not answer all questions. Part 13. The Human Cost and Cultural Impact. Beyond the legal and forensic dimensions, the Boston Strangler case had profound human and cultural impacts that rippled through generations. The families of victims carried their grief and trauma for decades. The city of Boston was marked by the murders in ways both visible and subtle. And American culture more broadly absorbed lessons about vulnerability, fear, and the nature of evil. For the families of victims, the uncertainty about DeSalvo's guilt added another layer of suffering to their loss. Families like the Sullivans, who never believed DeSalvo was responsible for their loved one's murder, felt that justice had been denied. Even the 2013 DNA evidence did not fully resolve their doubts. They had been fighting for truth and justice for half a century, and while the DNA provided some answers, it did not restore what had been taken from them. Other families found some measure of peace in accepting that DeSalvo was the killer. The belief that the perpetrator had been identified, even if not formally convicted, allowed them to move forward with their grief. Yet, they too carried the weight of unanswered questions and the knowledge that the legal system had never formally held anyone accountable for these murders. Boston itself was transformed by the murders. The city's self-image as a safe, civilized place where traditional values prevailed was shattered. The murders occurred during a period of social upheaval in America, with the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War protests, and the sexual revolution all challenging established norms. The Boston Strangler became a symbol of a society coming apart, where the old certainties no longer held. Neighborhoods where victims had lived became marked by the crimes. Addresses like 77 Gainsborough Street, where Anna Sleesers was killed, or 44A Harl Street, where Mary Sullivan died, carried the weight of tragedy. For residents of these buildings and neighborhoods, the murders were not historical curiosities, but immediate, personal realities that shaped their sense of place and safety. The case also highlighted issues of class, age, and gender in mid-century America. Most of the early victims were elderly women living alone on modest incomes. They were vulnerable not just because they were women, but because they were older, less able to defend themselves, and often isolated from family support. Society's failure to protect these women raised uncomfortable questions about how different populations were valued and protected. The younger victims, when they began to appear, challenged different assumptions. Young women were supposed to be vibrant and strong, capable and modern. Yet they too fell victim to violence in their own homes. The murders of Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Beverly Sammons, and Joanne Graff showed that youth and strength provided no protection against a determined predator. The case became a cultural touchstone, referenced in books, films, television shows, and academic studies. The 1968 film, The Boston Strangler, starring Tony Curtis, shaped public perceptions of the case for generations. While the film took dramatic liberties and presented DeSalvo's guilt as established fact, it captured the fear and atmosphere of the era. The split-screen technique used in the film became iconic, suggesting the fragmented, paranoid perspective of a city under siege. True crime as a genre was profoundly influenced by the Boston Strangler case. The combination of mystery, violence, psychological complexity, and investigative drama made it a template for countless books, documentaries, and television programs. The case demonstrated public appetite for detailed accounts of real crimes and helped establish true crime as a major category in publishing and broadcasting. The Boston Strangler also influenced how subsequent serial killer cases were investigated and reported. The term serial killer itself would not come into common usage until the 1970s. But the Boston Strangler case helped define what that term would mean. The pattern of repeated murders, the psychological profile of the killer, the forensic investigation, the media coverage, all set precedents that would be followed in later cases. For women who lived through the era, The Boston Strangler represented a fundamental shift in how they experienced urban life. Many women who were young adults in the 1960s remember the fear, the precautions, the sense that nowhere was truly safe. They remember being warned by parents and friends, installing new locks, avoiding being alone. This generation of women grew up with a heightened awareness of vulnerability that shaped their attitudes and behaviors for the rest of their lives. The murders also sparked discussions about women's independence and safety. Some conservative voices argued that the murders proved women should not live alone, that traditional family structures provided necessary protection. Others argued that the solution was not to restrict women's freedom, but to improve policing, security, and support systems that would allow women to live independently without fear. These debates about women's safety and independence continue today. The Boston Strangler case is often invoked in discussions about violence against women, urban safety, and the balance between freedom and security. The case serves as a reminder that violence against women is not a new phenomenon, and that societies have long struggled with how to prevent and respond to such violence. This psychological transformation was not unique to Boston. Other cities that have experienced serial murders report similar shifts in collective consciousness. The sense of community safety, once lost, is difficult to restore. Even when the killer is caught or the murders stop, the memory of fear remains. The Boston Strangler case also raised questions about how society responds to evil. The murders seemed senseless, motiveless in any rational sense. The victims were chosen seemingly at random. The violence appeared gratuitous, beyond what was necessary to commit the crimes. This apparent senselessness challenged people's understanding of human nature and morality. Some sought explanations in psychology, arguing that DeSalvo's troubled childhood and mental illness explained his actions. Others turned to religion or philosophy, grappling with questions about the existence of evil and the nature of human depravity. Still others focused on social factors, pointing to violence in media, breakdown of traditional values, or failures of mental health and social service systems. These debates about the causes of serial murder continue today. The Boston Strangler case was one of the first to receive such intense public scrutiny and to spark such widespread discussion. It helped establish frameworks for thinking about serial killers that persist in both academic and popular discourse. Part 14. Unresolved Questions and Modern Perspectives. More than 6 decades after the first murder, the Boston Strangler case remains a source of fascination and frustration. Despite the 2013 DNA evidence linking DeSalvo to Mary Sullivan's murder, many questions remain unanswered. These unresolved issues continue to fuel debate among researchers, investigators, and true crime enthusiasts. The most fundamental question is whether Albert DeSalvo killed all 13 women attributed to the Boston Strangler. The DNA evidence connects him definitively to one victim, Mary Sullivan. But what about the other 12? Without similar DNA evidence from those crime scenes, we cannot know with certainty whether DeSalvo was responsible. The theory that multiple killers were involved remains compelling to many researchers. The differences in victim age, method, and crime scene characteristics suggest that the Boston Strangler might have been 2, 3, or even more individuals whose crimes were conflated by media coverage and public panic. If this theory is correct, then some of the real killers were never caught and their crimes were incorrectly attributed to DeSalvo. Another unresolved question concerns the role of George Nassar. How much did Nassar know about the murders? Did he feed information to DeSalvo to help him construct a false confession? Or was Nassar simply a conduit through which DeSalvo's genuine confession reached authorities? Nassar's own statements have been contradictory over the years, sometimes supporting DeSalvo's guilt and other times suggesting the confession was fabricated. The financial motives behind DeSalvo's confession also remain murky. DeSalvo's family was struggling financially, and there were hopes that a book or movie deal might provide income. F. Lee Bailey stood to gain from the publicity of representing such a notorious client. George Nassar might have benefited in ways that are not fully understood. These financial incentives raise questions about whether DeSalvo's confession was sincere or calculated. The murder of Albert DeSalvo in prison adds another layer of mystery. Who killed him and why? Was it simply prison violence, the result of his status as a sex offender? Or was he killed to silence him, perhaps because he was preparing to recant his confession or reveal information that would embarrass investigators or implicate others? The investigation of DeSalvo's murder was inconclusive. Rumors circulated about who might have been responsible, but no one was ever charged. This unsolved murder within the larger unsolved mystery creates a recursive pattern of unanswered questions. Some evidence from the original crime scenes may still exist in storage, misfiled or forgotten. Periodic efforts have been made to locate and catalog evidence from the Boston Strangler cases, but these efforts have been hampered by the passage of time, changes in record-keeping systems, and the sheer volume of material that accumulated during the investigation. The question of whether DeSalvo acted alone, even in the murders he did commit, remains open. Could he have had an accomplice? Some researchers have suggested that certain aspects of the crimes, particularly the apparent ease with which the killer gained entry to apartments, might indicate that two people were working together. One could distract or reassure the victim while the other prepared to attack. However, no evidence of an accomplice has ever been found. The psychiatric aspects of the case also raise unresolved questions. DeSalvo was diagnosed with various mental illnesses, but the precise nature of his psychological condition remains debated. Was he a true psychopath, incapable of empathy or remorse? Was he suffering from dissociative disorders that might have caused him to forget details of crimes he actually committed? Or was he a troubled but calculating individual who fabricated a confession for personal gain? Modern criminal profilers who have studied the case note that DeSalvo's behavior as the Green Man does not necessarily predict behavior as a killer. Sexual assault and murder exist on a continuum of violence, but they are not the same crime. Many individuals who commit sexual assaults never escalate to murder. The fact that DeSalvo was the Green Man does not automatically make him the Boston Strangler. Conversely, some profilers argue that the Green Man crimes do show a pattern of escalating violence and control over victims that could have led to murder. DeSalvo's method of gaining entry to homes by deception, his targeting of women living alone, and his increasingly bold behavior all suggest someone who might have been capable of the Strangler murders. The role of confirmation bias in the investigation is another area of concern. Once DeSalvo confessed, investigators may have unconsciously interpreted evidence in ways that supported his guilt. Contradictory evidence may have been dismissed or rationalized. Alternative suspects may have been inadequately investigated. This is a common problem in criminal investigations, and the Boston Strangler case provides a cautionary example. The impact of the $10,000 reward offered by Governor Peabody remains a contentious issue. Critics argue that this reward created a financial incentive for false confessions. Supporters argue that rewards are a legitimate investigative tool and that DeSalvo never actually collected the money. The question of whether the reward influenced DeSalvo's decision to confess cannot be definitively answered. The preservation and testing of DNA evidence from other victims remains a priority for some investigators and family members. As technology continues to advance, samples that are currently too degraded or too small to test may become analyzable. Future breakthroughs in forensic science could finally answer the question of whether DeSalvo killed some, all, or none of the other victims. Some researchers have called for a comprehensive review of all the Boston Strangler cases using modern investigative techniques. This review would involve re-examining all available evidence, re-interviewing surviving witnesses, and applying current understanding of serial murder to the case. Such a review could potentially identify new leads or alternative suspects that were overlooked in the 1960s. The question of whether justice was served also remains unresolved. Even if DeSalvo was the killer, he was never tried or convicted of the Strangler murders. The families of victims were denied the formal acknowledgement and closure that a trial might have provided. The public never got to see the evidence tested in court, and DeSalvo himself was murdered before he could potentially recant, clarify, or expand on his confession. Modern perspectives on the case have been influenced by advances in understanding serial killers, improvements in forensic science, and changes in social attitudes. Contemporary researchers bring different questions and assumptions to the case than investigators did in the 1960s. This evolution in perspective helps us see aspects of the case that were invisible or unimportant to earlier investigators. The role of gender in the investigation and its aftermath has received increased attention. The victims were all women, and the gendered nature of the violence was central to the crimes. Yet, the investigation was conducted almost entirely by men, and the narrative that emerged reflected male perspectives on women's vulnerability and women's safety. Modern feminist scholars have critiqued aspects of the investigation and coverage, arguing that the victims were sometimes objectified or blamed for their own deaths. The racial and ethnic dimensions of the case have also been examined. Boston in the 1960s was a city marked by racial tension and segregation. Edward Brooks' role as the only African-American Attorney General added a racial dimension to the investigation's leadership. Some victims were immigrants or first-generation Americans, and questions have been raised about whether their cases received the same attention and resources as cases involving native-born white women. The Boston Strangler case continues to generate new research and analysis. Podcasts, documentaries, books, and academic papers regularly revisit the case, offering new perspectives or uncovering new information. Each generation seems to find something new in the case, some aspect that resonates with contemporary concerns or illuminates aspects of crime, justice, or society. Part 15. The investigation's legacy and impact on policing. The Boston Strangler investigation, for all its frustrations and unresolved questions, left a significant legacy in American law enforcement. The innovations and lessons from this case influenced how police departments approached serial murders for decades afterward. The creation of the Strangler Bureau was groundbreaking for its time. Before this case, multi-jurisdictional task forces were rare, and there was little framework for coordinating investigations across different police departments. The Strangler Bureau, despite its flaws, demonstrated that complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions required centralized coordination and information sharing. This lesson was not immediately absorbed by all law enforcement agencies. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, similar coordination problems plagued investigations of other serial killers. However, the Boston Strangler case was frequently cited as an example of why coordination was necessary, and gradually, protocols for multi-jurisdictional task forces became more common and more sophisticated. The involvement of psychiatric consultants in the investigation was also innovative. The attempt to develop a psychological profile of the killer, while imperfect, represented an early version of what would later become criminal profiling. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, established in 1972, built on lessons from cases like the Boston Strangler to develop more systematic approaches to understanding and predicting serial killer behavior. The medical examiners who worked on the Boston Strangler cases made important contributions to forensic pathology. Their careful documentation of injuries, their analysis of ligature marks, and their attempts to establish time of death all advanced the field. Some of the techniques they developed or refined are still used today in investigating strangulation deaths. The Boston Strangler investigation exposed weaknesses in how police departments managed and shared information. The vast amount of paperwork generated by the investigation, more than 37,000 pages, was difficult to organize and analyze with the tools available in the 1960s. Today, computerized databases and case management systems make it easier to track leads, identify patterns, and share information across agencies. The case also demonstrated the double-edged nature of media coverage in serial murder investigations. On one hand, Publicity helped generate tips from the public and may have prompted some women to take precautions that saved their lives. On the other hand, the intense media attention created pressure on investigators, sensationalized the crimes, and may have contributed to copycat behavior or false confessions. Modern law enforcement has developed more sophisticated approaches to managing media relations during serial murder investigations. The goal is to keep the public informed without compromising the investigation or causing unnecessary panic. The Boston Strangler case serves as a cautionary tale of how media coverage can both help and hinder an investigation. The failure to prosecute DeSalvo for the Strangler murders, despite his confession, reinforced the legal principle that confessions alone are insufficient for conviction. This principle has been tested many times since the Boston Strangler case, and it remains a cornerstone of American criminal justice. Prosecutors must present corroborating evidence, not just a confession, to secure a conviction. The involvement of Peter Hurkos, the psychic, was widely viewed as a misstep that damaged the credibility of the investigation. Since the Boston Strangler case, law enforcement agencies have generally been more cautious about involving psychics in investigations. While some departments still consult psychics in desperate cases, they typically do so quietly and without the fanfare that surrounded Hurkos' involvement. The case also influenced how police departments handle witness interviews and suspect interrogations. The recognition that confessions can be false, that witnesses can be mistaken, and that memory is fallible has led to reforms in interviewing techniques. The importance of recording interviews, using non-leading questions, and seeking independent corroboration are all lessons that have been reinforced by cases like the Boston Strangler. The geographic profiling aspects of the case, while not fully developed at the time, represented early attempts to analyze the spatial patterns of serial crimes. Modern geographic profiling techniques, which use sophisticated algorithms to identify likely areas where a serial offender lives or works, build on the basic observations made by Boston Strangler investigators about where the crimes occurred and what that might reveal about the killer. The Boston Strangler investigation also contributed to discussions about the role of victimology in solving crimes. Understanding who the victims were, why they might have been chosen, and what they had in common proved crucial to developing theories about the killer. This focus on victims, while sometimes criticized for seeming to blame them, has become standard practice in investigating serial crimes. The case influenced training for law enforcement officers. The Boston Strangler investigation is often used as a case study in police academies and criminal justice programs. Students learn about the challenges of multi-jurisdictional coordination, the importance of evidence preservation, the potential for false confessions, and the role of forensic science in solving complex crimes. The psychological impact on investigators who worked the case has also been studied. The stress of investigating serial murders, the pressure from the public and media, and the emotional toll of dealing with such violent crimes all took their toll on detectives and other personnel. This recognition has led to better support systems for law enforcement officers working on traumatic cases. The Boston Strangler case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about cold case investigations. As DNA technology continues to advance, more cases from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s are being reopened and potentially solved. The Boston Strangler case demonstrates both the potential of these new technologies and the challenges of applying them to old evidence. Part 16: Cultural Representations and Public Memory. The Boston Strangler has been the subject of numerous books, films, documentaries, and other cultural representations. These portrayals have shaped public understanding of the case and raised questions about how true crime should be depicted. The 1968 film, The Boston Strangler, was perhaps the most influential cultural representation. Starring Tony Curtis as Albert DeSalvo and directed by Richard Fleischer, the film presented a dramatized version of the case that took significant liberties with the facts. The movie's innovative use of split-screen cinematography created a visual representation of fragmentation and paranoia that captured the atmosphere of terror that gripped Boston during the murders. However, the film presented DeSalvo's guilt as established fact, ignoring the ambiguities and uncertainties that surrounded the case even in 1968. This presentation influenced generations of viewers who came to believe that the case had been definitively solved. The film's artistic choices, while effective cinematically, contributed to a simplified narrative that obscured the case's complexity. Gerald Frank's book, The Boston Strangler, published in 1966, was similarly influential. Frank had access to many of the key figures in the case, including John Bottomley and Albert DeSalvo himself. His book provided a detailed account that was extensively researched but also presented DeSalvo's guilt as certain. The book sold millions of copies and established many of the tropes that would be repeated in subsequent accounts. In contrast, Susan Kelly's The Boston Stranglers, published in 1995, challenged the conventional narrative and argued that DeSalvo had not committed all or perhaps any of the murders. Kelly's research uncovered inconsistencies in DeSalvo's confession and raised questions that had been ignored or dismissed by earlier accounts. Her work helped spark renewed interest in the case and contributed to efforts to test DNA evidence. Casey Sherman's A Rose for Mary, published in 2003, approached the case from a personal perspective. As Mary Sullivan's nephew, Sherman had a direct stake in determining the truth about his aunt's murder. His book combined investigative journalism with family memoir, providing insights into how the case affected victims' families over decades. Numerous documentaries have examined the Boston Strangler case, each bringing different perspectives and emphases. Some have focused on the investigation and the evidence against DeSalvo. Others have explored alternative theories and potential suspects. Still others have examined the case's social and cultural context, looking at what it revealed about Boston, about American society in the 1960s, and about attitudes toward women and violence. Television shows have also featured the Boston Strangler case, sometimes as the subject of entire episodes and other times as reference points in fictional crime dramas. These representations have varied in their accuracy and thoughtfulness, with some providing careful analysis and others sensationalizing the crimes for entertainment value. The case has been discussed in academic contexts as well, in criminology courses, sociology classes, gender studies programs, and other settings. Scholarly articles have examined various aspects of the case, from forensic questions to media coverage to the investigation's impact on law enforcement practices. This generational difference in memory affects how the case is understood. Those who remember the fear of the early 1960s have a visceral understanding of the case's impact that cannot be fully conveyed through historical accounts. Younger people can analyze the case more dispassionately, but may miss some of the emotional and psychological dimensions that were central to those who lived through it. The Boston Strangler has become a cultural reference point, a shorthand for a particular kind of terror. References to the case appear in popular culture, from novels to television shows to casual conversation. The name Boston Strangler has achieved a kind of iconic status, recognized even by people who know little about the actual details of the case. This iconic status raises ethical questions about how we remember and represent violent crimes. Should such crimes be the subject of entertainment? Do films and books about serial killers glorify violence or help us understand it? How do we balance the public's appetite for true crime with respect for victims and their families? These questions have been particularly acute in the case of the Boston Strangler because of the ongoing uncertainties about DeSalvo's guilt. Representations that present his guilt as certain may be misleading, but representations that explore alternative theories risk being dismissed as conspiracy thinking or revisionism. Finding the right balance is challenging. The families of victims have had mixed reactions to cultural representations of the case. Some have felt that books and films have kept the memory of their loved ones alive and have drawn attention to the need for justice. Others have felt exploited, that their family tragedies have been commodified for profit and entertainment. These concerns are not unique to the Boston Strangler case but are highlighted by its high profile and commercial success. The case has also influenced how subsequent serial murder cases are covered and represented in media. The Boston Strangler helped establish templates for true crime narratives. The vulnerable victims, the terrified city, the frustrated investigators, the shocking revelation of the killer's identity. These narrative elements appear repeatedly in accounts of other cases, for better and worse. The proliferation of true crime as a genre, particularly in podcasts and streaming documentaries, has brought renewed attention to cases like the Boston Strangler. New generations of true crime enthusiasts have discovered the case and brought fresh perspectives. Some have become amateur investigators, reviewing evidence and developing their own theories. This democratization of crime analysis has both benefits and drawbacks. The Boston Strangler case demonstrates how true crime can be both educational and problematic. At its best, true crime can illuminate important questions about justice, society, and human behavior. It can honor victims and support their families' quests for answers. At its worst, it can sensationalize violence, exploit tragedy, and spread misinformation. The challenge is to engage with true crime responsibly, with awareness of these tensions. Part 17. Comparative analysis with other serial murder cases. The Boston Strangler case occurred during a transitional period in how American society understood and responded to serial murder. Comparing it to other cases from the same era and from later decades reveals both what made the Boston Strangler unique and what it shared with other serial murder investigations. The term serial killer was not in common use during the Boston Strangler murders. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit would not formalize the definition until the 1970s. However, the concept of a single killer responsible for multiple murders over an extended period was recognized, even if the terminology was different. Earlier cases, such as the Cleveland torso murders of the 1930s and the murders attributed to the Zodiac Killer in the late 1960s, showed similar patterns of multiple victims and prolonged investigations. The victim profile in the Boston Strangler case was unusual in its variation. Most serial killers target a specific type of victim: young women, prostitutes, children, elderly people, or some other defined group. The Boston Strangler victims ranged from 19 to 85 years old, an extraordinarily wide age range. This variation was one of the factors that led investigators to question whether a single killer was responsible. In contrast, other serial killers from the same era showed more consistent victim selection. The Zodiac Killer, active in Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, typically targeted young couples. The killer, known as the co-ed killer, Edmund Kemper, murdered college-age women in California in the early 1970s. These more consistent patterns made it easier to identify the crimes as the work of a single perpetrator. The method of killing in the Boston Strangler cases, strangulation, is common among serial killers. Strangulation is an intimate form of killing that involves direct physical contact and takes several minutes. Serial killers who strangle their victims often do so because they derive psychological satisfaction from the control and domination involved. This aspect of the Boston Strangler cases fit established patterns of serial murder. However, the variation in other aspects of the murders, such as the degree of sexual assault and the positioning of bodies, again suggested possible multiple perpetrators. Some serial killers evolved their methods over time, becoming more violent or developing new rituals. But the Boston Strangler crimes showed variation that seemed to reflect different personalities rather than evolution of a single personality. The public reaction to the Boston Strangler was similar to reactions to other serial murder cases: widespread fear, media sensationalism, pressure on law enforcement, and changes in public behavior. These reactions would be seen again with the Zodiac Killer, the Atlanta child murders of the late 1970s and early 1980s, and many subsequent cases. The Boston Strangler helped establish patterns of public response that would become familiar in later serial murder cases. The use of psychological profiling in the Boston Strangler investigation was pioneering but primitive by later standards. The FBI's profiling unit, established in the 1970s, would develop much more sophisticated techniques based partly on lessons from cases like the Boston Strangler. Profilers would interview captured serial killers, including Ted Bundy and others, to understand their psychology and behavior patterns. The confession aspect of the Boston Strangler case has parallels in other serial murder investigations. False confessions have been a recurring problem, with some individuals confessing to high-profile crimes they did not commit. The case of Henry Lee Lucas, who confessed to hundreds of murders in the 1980s, most of which he did not commit, demonstrates how false confessions can complicate investigations. The Boston Strangler case helped establish the principle that confessions must be corroborated with independent evidence. The lack of physical evidence linking DeSalvo to the crime scenes was unusual for serial murder cases. Most serial killers leave some physical evidence: fingerprints, biological material, or items taken from victims. The apparent absence of such evidence in the Boston Strangler cases either suggests that the killer was extraordinarily careful or raises questions about whether the crimes were thoroughly processed for evidence. The role of DNA evidence in potentially solving the Boston Strangler case decades after the murders has parallels in other cold cases. The Golden State Killer case, solved in 2018 through genetic genealogy techniques, showed how advancing technology can finally identify perpetrators decades after their crimes. However, the Golden State Killer case resulted in a definitive identification and prosecution, while the Boston Strangler case remains more ambiguous despite the DNA evidence. The impact on the victims' families in the Boston Strangler case mirrors the impact in other serial murder cases. The trauma, the decades of uncertainty, the quest for answers and justice, all are common across serial murder cases. The Sullivan family's persistence in seeking the truth parallels similar efforts by families in other cases who refuse to accept official narratives they believe are wrong. However, even with modern tools, serial murders remain challenging to solve. The recent case of the Long Island serial killer, with victims discovered in 2010 but not followed by arrest until 2023, shows that even with advanced forensic technology, these investigations can be extremely difficult. The Boston Strangler case reminds us that some mysteries may never be fully solved, even with the best available tools. Part 18: The Science of Strangulation and Forensic Pathology. Understanding the medical and forensic aspects of the Boston Strangler murders provides important context for evaluating the case. Strangulation as a cause of death has specific characteristics that can help investigators determine what happened and potentially identify the perpetrator. Strangulation can be divided into three main categories: hanging, ligature strangulation, and manual strangulation. In the Boston Strangler cases, ligature strangulation was the primary method. The killer used items found in the victims' homes, such as stockings, scarves, belts, and cord, to compress the neck and cut off blood flow to the brain and airflow to the lungs. Forensic pathologists examining strangulation deaths look for specific signs. External signs include ligature marks on the neck, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes and face, and bruising or abrasions. Internal signs include fractures of the hyoid bone or thyroid cartilage, hemorrhaging in the neck muscles, and damage to blood vessels. The pattern and severity of these signs can provide information about how the strangulation occurred. In the Boston Strangler cases, medical examiners documented these signs carefully. The ligature marks showed distinctive patterns that suggested the killer used specific techniques. The presence of multiple ligatures in some cases, tied in elaborate knots or bows, suggested that the killer took time with this aspect of the crime. This deliberateness indicated that the ligature was important to the killer beyond its function as a murder weapon. The time required for strangulation, death varies but typically takes several minutes of sustained pressure. This extended period distinguishes strangulation from faster methods of killing. The person being strangled usually loses consciousness within 10 to 15 seconds due to lack of blood flow to the brain, but death takes several more minutes as the brain and heart are deprived of oxygen. This means the killer must maintain pressure for an extended period, requiring sustained physical effort and continued intent. The psychological aspects of strangulation as a murder method are significant. Unlike shooting or stabbing from a distance, strangulation requires intimate, sustained physical contact with the victim. The killer must be close enough to touch, must maintain that contact for minutes, and must continue despite any struggles or sounds from the victim. This intimacy suggests particular psychological characteristics in the killer. Forensic experts have noted that strangulation is often associated with sexual motivation in murder. The physical closeness, the control over life and death, and the face-to-face nature of the act can have sexual dimensions for some killers. In the Boston Strangler cases, the combination of strangulation with sexual assault supported this connection. The positioning of bodies after death was another aspect that medical examiners analyzed. In several Boston Strangler cases, the killer arranged the bodies in specific, often degrading positions. This post-mortem positioning is sometimes called staging and can provide insights into the killer's psychology. Some killers stage scenes to shock whoever discovers the body. Others stage scenes to fulfill personal fantasies or rituals. The medical evidence also addressed the question of whether the murders could have been committed by the same person. Dr. Michael Luongo and other members of the medical committee noted differences in the patterns of violence. The murders of elderly women tended to be less violent overall, with strangulation being the primary form of attack. The murders of younger women showed more violence, including beating, stabbing, and more severe sexual assault. The forensic examination of ligatures provided important information. The type of knots used, the tightness of the ligatures, and whether they were tied before or after death all had investigative significance. In several cases, the killer had tied ligatures in distinctive bows, a detail that seemed to be a signature. This signature suggested personal meaning for the killer, possibly related to childhood experiences or psychological symbolism. The sexual assault evidence was examined carefully but yielded limited information given the forensic capabilities of the 1960s. Semen samples were collected and preserved, but without DNA technology, they could only be analyzed through blood typing, which provided minimal individualizing information. Decades later, these same samples would become crucial when DNA testing became available. The question of whether victims had been raped before or after death was addressed through examination of injuries and other physical evidence. In most cases, medical examiners concluded that sexual assault had occurred before death, though in some cases the evidence was ambiguous. This timing was relevant to understanding the killer's psychology and motivations. Toxicology testing was performed on victims to determine whether they had been drugged or incapacitated before being killed. No evidence of drugging was found in any of the cases. This suggested that the killer subdued victims through physical force or surprise rather than chemical means. The medical evidence also addressed the question of the killer's strength. Strangulation requires significant physical strength, particularly when the victim resists. The fact that the killer was able to overpower women of various ages and physical conditions suggested someone of at least average strength and probably above average. However, surprise and the psychological shock of being attacked can make even strong individuals unable to effectively resist. Some medical examiners noted that the technique used in the strangulations suggested someone with knowledge of how to kill efficiently. The placement of ligatures, the amount of pressure applied, and the duration of strangulation all indicated someone who knew what they were doing. This raised questions about whether the killer had previous experience with strangulation, perhaps in a military or law enforcement context, or whether the apparent skill was simply the result of multiple murders. The preservation of bodies and evidence varied across the cases. Some victims were discovered relatively quickly after death, allowing for more thorough forensic examination. Others, like Jane Sullivan, were not discovered for several days, which complicated the medical examination and limited what could be determined about the circumstances of death. Modern forensic pathologists reviewing the Boston Strangler cases have noted both strengths and weaknesses in the original medical examinations. Given the limitations of 1960s forensic science, the medical examiners did thorough work in documenting injuries, collecting evidence, and analyzing the causes of death. However, modern techniques could have provided much more information, particularly about the identity of the killer through DNA analysis. The Boston Strangler cases contributed to the development of forensic pathology as a specialty. The careful documentation of strangulation deaths, the analysis of ligature patterns, and the integration of medical findings with investigative work all represented best practices that would influence how future cases were handled. Part 19. The Psychology of Serial Murder and Criminal Profiling. The Boston Strangler case occurred at a time when the psychological understanding of serial killers was still developing. The investigation included attempts to profile the killer based on his behavior, representing an early application of what would later become a sophisticated field of criminal psychology. Some elements of this profile were remarkably accurate if DeSalvo was indeed the killer. He was a white male in his early 30s during the murders, of average height, with documented problems in his relationship with his wife. However, other elements of the profile were less accurate. The profile suggested the killer would be socially isolated and possibly unemployed, while DeSalvo held a job and maintained a family life. The psychological theories about what motivated the killer focused on issues of power, control, and sexual dysfunction. The murders were understood as expressions of rage toward women, possibly stemming from childhood trauma or dysfunctional relationships with mother figures. The sexual assaults were seen not primarily as expressions of sexual desire but as means of asserting dominance and inflicting humiliation. These psychological interpretations were influenced by Freudian theories that dominated psychiatry in the 1960s. More modern understanding of serial killers draws on a broader range of psychological theories, including attachment theory, neuropsychology, and evolutionary psychology. However, the basic insight that serial murder is fundamentally about power and control rather than sexual gratification remains valid. The concept of the sexual sadist was applied to the Boston Strangler. Sexual sadists derive pleasure from the suffering of others, and their crimes typically escalate in violence over time as they require more extreme acts to achieve satisfaction. Some aspects of the Boston Strangler crimes fit this pattern, particularly the increasing violence in later murders and the degrading positioning of bodies. However, the variation in victim selection and methods raised questions about whether a sexual sadist would really attack both elderly and young women, or whether these differences indicated multiple killers with different psychological profiles. Sexual sadists typically have specific fantasies they act out through their crimes, and these fantasies usually involve particular types of victims. The role of fantasy in serial murder was not as well understood in the 1960s as it is today. Modern research has shown that serial killers typically have elaborate fantasies that they rehearse mentally before acting them out. These fantasies drive the selection of victims, the methods of killing, and the rituals surrounding the crimes. The killer may try to make reality match the fantasy as closely as possible. If the Boston Strangler crimes were the work of a single killer, his fantasies apparently involved a range of victim types and scenarios. This flexibility in fantasy content would be unusual, but not impossible. Alternatively, the variation might indicate that the crimes were not primarily driven by sexual fantasy but by other motivations, such as anger, thrill-seeking, or compulsion. The question of whether the Boston Strangler was psychotic or psychopathic was debated by mental health professionals. Psychosis involves a loss of contact with reality, including hallucinations or delusions. Psychopathy, now more commonly called antisocial personality disorder, involves a lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and disregard for social norms. Most serial killers are not psychotic, but many show psychopathic traits. DeSalvo was diagnosed with various conditions, including sociopathy with schizoid features. These diagnoses suggested someone with serious personality pathology but not full psychosis. However, psychiatric diagnosis in the 1960s was less precise than modern diagnosis, and the exact nature of DeSalvo's mental condition remains debated. The role of childhood trauma in creating serial killers has been extensively studied. Most serial killers have histories of severe childhood abuse, neglect, or trauma. DeSalvo's childhood was marked by extreme violence and dysfunction, with an abusive father and exposure to sexual activity at an inappropriate age. These experiences would have profoundly affected his psychological development. The compulsive nature of serial murder is another important psychological aspect. Many serial killers describe their behavior as driven by compulsions they cannot fully control. They may experience building tension that is only released through killing, after which they feel temporary relief before the cycle begins again. This pattern suggests an addiction-like quality to serial murder. If DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, his behavior as the Green Man and Measuring Man might represent attempts to satisfy these compulsions without killing. However, as often happens with addictive behaviors, the lesser acts may have become insufficient, leading to escalation to murder. This escalation pattern is common in serial killers. The geographic aspects of the killer's psychology are also relevant. Serial killers typically operate in areas they know well, where they feel comfortable and confident. The Boston Strangler crimes occurred in a relatively contained geographic area, mostly in Boston and nearby communities. This pattern suggests a killer who was familiar with the area, who knew how to navigate it, and who felt at ease there. The method of gaining entry to victims' apartments required psychological skill. The killer apparently was able to present himself in a way that did not alarm women who were understandably cautious. This ability to appear trustworthy, even charming, is common among serial killers. Ted Bundy famously used his good looks and apparent helplessness to lure victims. The Boston Strangler apparently used some similar psychological manipulation. The question of whether the killer felt remorse or empathy for his victims is difficult to answer. True psychopaths feel no genuine remorse, though they may simulate it when advantageous. DeSalvo's apology to one of his Green Man victims after assaulting her might suggest some capacity for remorse, or it might have been manipulation designed to prevent her from immediately reporting the crime. The ritualistic elements of the crimes, particularly the distinctive bows tied in the ligatures, suggest symbolic meaning for the killer. Rituals in serial murder serve psychological functions for the killer, helping them feel a sense of control, completion, or satisfaction. Understanding these rituals can provide insights into the killer's psychology and potentially help identify them. Modern criminal profiling would approach the Boston Strangler cases with more sophisticated tools and theories than were available in the 1960s. However, the fundamental challenges would remain. Understanding the psychology of someone capable of such violence, identifying patterns that might lead to the killer, and determining whether the crimes were the work of one person or several. Part 20. Broader societal changes and prevention. The Boston Strangler murders occurred during a period of significant social change in America, and the case both reflected and influenced these changes. Understanding this broader context helps us see the case not just as a criminal investigation, but as a moment that revealed and shaped American society. The early 1960s were a time of transition in American gender relations. Women were entering the workforce in greater numbers, living independently, and challenging traditional roles. The Boston Strangler murders created tension around these changes. Some conservative voices argued that women living alone were putting themselves at risk and that traditional family structures provided necessary protection. However, others argued that women should not have to sacrifice independence and autonomy because of male violence. The solution, they contended, was not to restrict women's freedom, but to improve safety measures and law enforcement capabilities. This debate anticipated later feminist arguments about violence against women and how society should respond. The case contributed to changing attitudes about personal safety. Before the Boston Strangler, many people felt relatively safe in their own homes. The murders demonstrated that violence could invade even the most private, supposedly secure spaces. This realization contributed to a broader sense of insecurity that characterized the late 1960s and 1970s. The role of neighbors and community in preventing violence also came under scrutiny. In several of the Boston Strangler cases, neighbors heard sounds that might have indicated violence but did not investigate or call police. This failure of community vigilance was criticized, and there were calls for neighbors to be more aware and responsive to potential danger. However, the balance between community vigilance and privacy is delicate. Increased surveillance of neighbors' activities can create its own problems, including false accusations and violations of privacy. The Boston Strangler case raised these issues without providing clear solutions, and they remain contentious today. The murders also influenced discussions about mental health services. DeSalvo's history of mental illness and violent behavior raised questions about whether the mental health system had failed to identify and treat someone who posed a danger to others. Could the murders have been prevented if DeSalvo had received appropriate treatment earlier? These questions remain relevant today. The relationship between mental illness and violence is complex. Most people with mental illness are not violent, and most violence is not committed by people with diagnosed mental illness. However, some individuals with certain conditions and certain life circumstances do pose risks, and identifying and helping these individuals remains a challenge for mental health systems. The case also influenced law enforcement practices beyond those already discussed. Police departments increased patrols in areas where women lived alone. Officers were trained to take reports of suspicious activity more seriously. The overall level of police presence and activity increased, beginning a trend toward more intensive policing that would continue through the rest of the 20th century. These increased policing efforts had both positive and negative consequences. They may have prevented some crimes and made some people feel safer. However, they also led to increased surveillance, more intrusive police practices, and disparate impacts on different communities, particularly communities of color. The Boston Strangler case was one factor among many that shaped these developments. The role of media in creating public fear and shaping behavior was both evident and controversial. The extensive coverage of the Boston Strangler murders terrified many women, causing them to change their behaviors and routines. This fear, while understandable, was not proportional to the actual risk most individuals faced. The probability of any particular woman being a strangler victim was extremely low, yet the fear was widespread and intense. This pattern of media-amplified fear would be repeated in coverage of many subsequent crime stories. The relationship between media coverage, public fear, and actual risk remains a subject of debate. Should media outlets emphasize rare but dramatic crimes, or focus more on common but less sensational problems? How can journalists inform the public without creating disproportionate fear? The Boston Strangler case also contributed to discussions about capital punishment. Massachusetts had abolished the death penalty in 1984, though it was still in use in other states. The case was sometimes cited by death penalty supporters as an example of a crime so heinous that execution would be appropriate. However, the fact that DeSalvo was never convicted of the Strangler murders complicated this argument. The case influenced popular culture's representation of violence against women. The combination of sex and violence in the Boston Strangler murders established themes that would be replicated in countless books, films, and television shows. Critics have argued that this repeated representation of violence against women as entertainment is harmful, potentially desensitizing audiences and even glamorizing violence. The case contributed to broader discussions about crime and justice in American society. The 1960s saw rising crime rates and increasing public concern about law and order. The Boston Strangler became a symbol of societal breakdown and was used by some to argue for tougher law enforcement and criminal justice policies. These arguments would gain traction in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, contributing to policies like mandatory minimum sentences, three-strikes laws, and mass incarceration. The long-term consequences of these policies have been mixed at best, with significant social costs and questionable effects on public safety. The Boston Strangler case was one thread in a complex web of factors that shaped these policy developments. The international dimension of serial murder awareness also began with cases like the Boston Strangler. While serial murder occurs in many countries, the intensive media coverage and investigative focus that American cases received helped establish patterns that would be adopted elsewhere. The Boston Strangler became known internationally and influenced how other countries approached similar crimes. The case also had economic impacts. The fear generated by the murders affected Boston's economy in various ways. Some businesses suffered as people stayed home more. Other businesses, like locksmiths and security companies, benefited. Real estate markets were affected, with some women choosing not to live alone and some neighborhoods seeing decreased demand. These economic impacts, while difficult to quantify precisely, were real and significant. The legacy of the Boston Strangler in terms of crime prevention is mixed. Some specific changes, like improved apartment security, probably did prevent some crimes. Broader impacts on policing and public awareness may have had positive effects. However, the fundamental problem of violence against women persists, and many of the factors that enabled the Boston Strangler murders, such as social isolation and insufficient community support systems, remain challenges today. Part 21. Reflections on Justice and Closure. As we approach the end of this exploration of the Boston Strangler case, we must reflect on fundamental questions about justice, closure, and how society responds to horrific crimes. The Boston Strangler case raises these questions in particularly acute form because of its unresolved aspects and ambiguities. What does justice mean in a case where the alleged perpetrator was never tried for the murders? Albert DeSalvo died in prison, serving time for other crimes, but he was never formally held accountable for the Boston Strangler murders. Is this justice? The legal system never pronounced him guilty, yet he was widely believed to be the killer and suffered the social consequences of that belief. For some victims' families, the lack of a trial represented a fundamental failure of justice. They never got to see the evidence presented in court, never got to watch a jury deliberate, never got to hear a guilty verdict pronounced. The legal ritual of a trial, with all its formality and symbolism, serves important functions in acknowledging crime and validating victims' suffering. Its absence left a void. For other families, particularly the Sullivans who believed DeSalvo was innocent of their daughter's murder, a different kind of injustice occurred. They believed the wrong man had been blamed, that the real killer had escaped justice, and that their loved one's murder remained unsolved. The 2013 DNA evidence provided some answers but did not fully resolve their concerns. The concept of closure is often invoked in discussions of crime victims and their families. The idea is that solving a crime, catching the perpetrator, and seeing justice done provides closure that allows families to move forward with their grief. However, the Boston Strangler case demonstrates the limitations of this concept. The quest for truth is distinct from the quest for justice, though related. Truth involves understanding what actually happened, who was responsible, and why. Justice involves appropriate legal and social responses to wrongdoing. The Boston Strangler case struggles with both. We do not have complete truth about what happened and who was responsible, and we have not had complete justice in terms of legal accountability. This lack of resolution is frustrating, but also instructive. It reminds us that not all mysteries can be solved, not all questions can be answered, and not all wrongs can be fully righted. This uncomfortable reality is part of the human condition, and coming to terms with it is part of processing tragedy and grief. The role of ongoing investigation and re-examination in cases like this raises questions about when, if ever, we should stop looking for answers. Resources are limited, and cold cases compete with current crimes for attention. At what point do we accept that a case will never be fully solved and move on? Or should we always remain open to new evidence and new interpretations? The Boston Strangler case suggests that there is value in continued investigation even decades after events. The 2013 DNA evidence, which came nearly 50 years after the last murder, provided new information that changed understanding of the case. Future technological advances might yield additional insights. As long as evidence exists and people care about finding answers, investigation can continue. However, there are also costs to endless re-examination. Family members may find it difficult to move forward when the case is constantly reopened. False hopes can be raised and dashed repeatedly. Resources devoted to old cases are not available for new ones. The balance between persistence and acceptance is difficult to strike. The public's relationship to unsolved cases is also complex. There is a segment of the public that is fascinated by true crime and invests significant time and energy in analyzing unsolved cases. This amateur investigation can sometimes generate useful insights and keep pressure on authorities to continue working on cases. However, it can also spread misinformation, harass innocent people, and cause pain to victims' families. The Boston Strangler case has been the subject of extensive amateur investigation, with independent researchers developing theories and identifying alternative suspects. Some of this work has been valuable, particularly the efforts by Casey Sherman and others to push for DNA testing. However, some amateur investigation has been less responsible, promoting speculative theories without adequate evidence. The question of forgiveness and redemption also arises in cases involving such serious crimes. If DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, should society have any concern for his humanity, or is he simply a monster to be condemned? DeSalvo himself, like all people, was a complex individual shaped by his experiences, including severe childhood trauma and abuse. Understanding the factors that create serial killers does not excuse their crimes or diminish the suffering of victims. However, it may help us prevent future crimes by addressing root causes like childhood abuse, untreated mental illness, and social isolation. The Boston Strangler case, like all cases of serious violence, challenges us to balance acknowledgement of human complexity with appropriate moral judgment and legal accountability. The legacy of the Boston Strangler for the city of Boston itself involves ongoing processing of trauma and memory. The murders remain part of the city's collective history, a dark chapter that cannot be forgotten. How the city remembers and commemorates the victims, how it incorporates this history into its sense of identity, affects both how residents understand their past and how they approach present challenges. Memorialization of crime victims is a delicate matter. Victims should be remembered and honored, but in ways that respect their dignity and their families' wishes. They should not be reduced to their status as crime victims, but remembered as full human beings who lived meaningful lives. Finding ways to accomplish this respectful memorialization remains an ongoing challenge. For those directly affected by the Boston Strangler murders, victims' families, witnesses, investigators, and others, the case represents personal tragedy and professional challenge. Their experiences remind us that behind every true crime story are real people who suffered real harm and who continue to live with the consequences. Respecting their experiences and honoring their memories is paramount. As we conclude this exploration, we remember the 13 women who lost their lives: Anna Sleezers, Mary Mullen, Nina Nichols, Helen Blake, Ida Irga, Jane Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Brown, Beverly Sammons, Evelyn Corbin, Joanne Graff, and Mary Sullivan. They deserved to live full lives in safety and dignity. They deserved justice. While the justice system may have fallen short, we can still honor their memories by learning from this case and working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Conclusion: the enduring mystery. We have traveled together through more than 6 decades of history, investigation, and debate surrounding the Boston Strangler case. From that first terrible discovery on a June evening in 1962, through the terrifying months that followed, through the controversial confession and its aftermath, through decades of doubt and new evidence, this case has challenged and fascinated everyone who has encountered it. What can we say with certainty after this long journey? We know that 13 women were murdered in the greater Boston area between June 1962 and January 1964. We know that their deaths created widespread fear and prompted one of the largest criminal investigations in Massachusetts history. We know that Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, but was never tried for these murders. We know that he died in prison, taking whatever secrets he held to his grave. We know that in 2013, DNA evidence linked DeSalvo to the murder of Mary Sullivan, providing scientific confirmation of his involvement in at least one of the crimes. We know that questions remain about whether he committed all, some, or only one of the murders attributed to the Boston Strangler. What we do not know, and may never know with absolute certainty, is the complete truth about who killed these 13 women and why. This uncertainty is frustrating, unsatisfying, and deeply troubling. Yet, it is also a reminder that reality is complex, that truth is sometimes elusive, and that even our best efforts to understand terrible events may fall short. The Boston Strangler case has influenced American culture, law enforcement practices, and public attitudes about safety and violence. It has shaped how we investigate serial murders, how we understand criminal psychology, and how we balance public information with investigative integrity. Its legacy extends far beyond the specific crimes it encompasses. For the families of victims, the case represents ongoing grief and an incomplete quest for justice. Some have found a measure of peace in accepting that DeSalvo was the killer. Others continue to believe that the true perpetrator was never caught and that justice has been denied. Both perspectives deserve respect and understanding. As you prepare for sleep tonight, let these thoughts settle gently in your mind. The Boston Strangler case, for all its darkness, ultimately speaks to fundamental aspects of the human experience: our vulnerability, our resilience, our capacity for both great evil and great compassion. It reminds us of the importance of justice, the value of truth, and the need to honor those who have suffered. May those 13 women rest in peace. May their families find what comfort and closure they can. And may we, as a society, continue to strive for justice and safety for all people, learning from the past to build a better future. If you found value in this exploration, I invite you to gently press the like button and subscribe to Whispered Mysteries for more in-depth examinations of cases that shaped history. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful.